and left it wiped on their own underwear. So we take their underwear and see if we can find DNA from the victim, because how can you explain how the victim's DNA got in his underwear? I mean, how do you explain that unless he actually did the crime? I mean, you can also argue that it was not a crime. Everything was willing, and which is legal. But in any event, this should prove that he was somewhat involved in what happened to the victim. Anyway, so the idea is that he picks up the victim's DNA and deposits it on his own underwear. Now, our DNA analysis is so precise, is so sensitive, and it's so good. There are times that when there was a consensual partner to the victim, the suspect, or whatever, the criminal, in his contact, he picked up the trace amounts of the consensual person and deposited it on his underwear. So it went from the consensual person, trace amounts to the victim. The victim, these trace amounts on the victim went to the suspect, and from the suspect's underwear, and we can still identify that consensual person. That's how good our DNA analysis is. The problem is that we have to make sure that when we're getting DNA, we're not getting DNA from this consensual person because they didn't do any crime. So we have to know, we have to be able to separate it from the suspect's DNA. But again, if we have the suspect's underwear, I'm pretty sure we can get his DNA. In any event, so sometimes, we can establish the time of the attack. If we find, let's say, moving, active sperm, that's only within 4 to 6 hours. I mean, they're alive, but they're just not going to move and be active after 4 to 6 hours. So we have to get there pretty quickly, and if we check for it immediately, we usually don't, but we check for it immediately, then we see them moving and active. We can tell, okay, this was done pretty not long before we actually arrived at the scene and took the samples. So we can tell more or less when the crime actually took place. We can find sperm with tails. Then it's usually within 16 hours. After 16 hours, you usually can't find it. Sometimes, however, you can find 1 or 2, even 3 days afterwards. We also have non-motile sperm. Might be alive, but it just doesn't move anymore. These can be found up to 3 days afterwards. And acid phosphatase, which comes from seminal fluid, even without sperm, can remain in there for 7 to 72 hours. After 72 hours, we can assume it's not there. So if we're finding certain things, we can realize or get some scientific evidence, I guess, not from the victim, not from the word of the victim, but scientific evidence as to when, more or less, the crime took place. It was mentioned that even consensual partners, they might have DNA around, so we have to make sure to get samples from the consensual people, because whoever they might be, because they're not, otherwise we're going to think they're the criminals, and they aren't. So we have to know whether there were any people that were consensual. So that way, if we find their DNA, we're not going to pursue it, because they were. Of course, we're going to find their DNA. It was not illegal for their DNA to be there, for them to whatever happened. So if there were any consensual partners within 72 hours. Then we have to know, we have to get the DNA from the consensual partners. After 72 hours, it was more than 72 hours before the attack, we don't have to worry too much, because all the evidence would have been gone by then. So here's a little bit of a review. You should know a little bit about immunoassays, how they work, how to use them to identify certain specific kinds of blood, understand blood test, luminol, understand about what seminal stains are, how they identify them, how we use them. Also, how we collect rape evidence, and find the time, and also how to deal with consensual partners. And for practice, if you have the textbook, here are the homework problems that you can use.